Well, welcome to TG2Cast Live. My guest tonight is Dr. David Kirkland, who is the Executive Director of the NYU Metropolitan Center for Research on Equity and the Transformation of Schools. Although I appreciate his scholarly interests are much far-ranging than what we're going to be able to discuss today. What has struck me the most in following Dr. Kirkland over these years is reading his writing and hearing him speak on this question of how we value or maybe don't value student language and literacies, and in particular those of young African-American men. And for me, Dr. Kirkland's enormous contribution has been countering this deficit narrative and just sort of theorizing that often surrounds this group of students, claiming that instead, really turning the tables on this whole idea that young Black men are profoundly literate in complex, multimodal, multi-layered, and I think he said it, beautiful ways. But as Dr. Kirkland puts it, in ways that we fail to recognize or value. And so welcome, David. I'm really glad to have you here today. We were talking before this, and our paths have been crossing for years. And one of these days we're going to meet in person. I've been out in the audience listening to you speak, but it's a joy to have you here today.
Thank you so much, Arthur. I'm looking forward to meeting you in person, and thank you for having me today.
Yeah, my pleasure. So like I said, I've known about you for a long time. You were a mentor and I would say hero to one of my student intern back at when I was in the Lansing area, Michigan State University teacher ed program. And then I had the good fortune of seeing you at NCTE 16 in Atlanta, Georgia. And I've just stayed interested in your work. It's such a joy to read, first of all. So much of what we read in education is so dry, turgid to read. And you are such a wonderful writer and a wonderful speaker. And so I really love all the references to my old stomping grounds too, because I also grew up in the Lansing area, and I basically lived most of my life in Michigan. So I just wanted to start out by saying thank you for your work and thank you for taking the time to be with us tonight. I wanted to start with this one quote that I want to frame kind of our discussion tonight. And by the way, we have some people listening, and I'm not sure how many people are out there, but if you want to, apparently, and I'm getting used to this myself, you can chime in with questions. We may not be able to take them in stride, but we'll try to get to them at the end. So if people are out there, feel free to do that. And we'll try to get to as many of those questions as possible. So there's this one quote that has resonated with me. You did an interview with Hip Hop Education, Brian Mooney, way back when, 2015, and I've quoted it several times. I think I reached out to you to ask if it was all right if I used it, because it's just great, and I think it captures a lot of your focus. Is we tell young urban kids that their identities don't matter. We tell them that the way they see the world doesn't matter. The way they construct selves within the world doesn't matter. And not only do we negate those identities, we criminalize them. We vilify those identities. So it's more than just ignoring. It's more than just discounting. It's this other thing that happens, this transmogrification that happens, this vicious, nasty, ugly alchemy that happens into the most deplorable things. We call criminal, only for these criminal, we call them deficit. And when I follow those same young people with burgeoning identities outside the classroom, they're reading and writing in complicated and beautiful ways, yet in ways that we fail to recognize and value. And it seems to me that in your career, you've zeroed in on this question of what it is to be literate, what is it to engage in literate practices. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about when and how you happened on that direction as a teacher and scholar, and how you began grappling with that question of literacy, maybe with, at the time, the available definitions of literacy, and then you began to formulate your own theories and definitions about what it is to be literate.
Yeah, I think there are three type of stories, but I want to focus in on two that get me to that place. One is, is as a classroom teacher, so as a classroom teacher, I'm in the course and I'm trying to teach, my students, and I'm noticing, this strange thing, that in my classroom and in my teaching, some of the same, deplorable types of patterns were playing out. The students who were not supposed to succeed were not succeeding, in my class. And here I am doing everything I can to conjure up, to engineer, this type of space. It was a space of listening. It was a space where we could support, all of our students to allow their identities and their abilities to be present, to be resident within the classroom. And I had one student, his name was Deshaun. And I remember Deshaun. Deshaun would come to classroom and he would talk the entire time during class. And I loved the guy. He had the gift of gab and he had this amazing social intelligence that we penalized in education. I would sit Sean in the back of the room. He would talk to everybody in the back. I'd put him in the middle. He'd talk to everybody in the middle. I would put him up front. He would talk to everybody up front. I would sit next to me and Sean would talk to me the entire class. He was a great kid. He was a great kid. But we didn't have a place for him. Other teachers were not as compassionate as me, and they would kick him out. They didn't see these assets, these social assets, these intellectual assets that he was bringing into the classroom as assets. They saw them as disruptive. They saw them as deficit. They saw him as less innocent. They didn't see his, kind of childhood nature. They saw him as something other than what he was. They didn't see him as innocent. And that was a problem because this young man was innocent. He was just a young man. And as a result, Sean got into some trouble. He got kicked out of school. He was part of this perpetual cycle of disproportionality, over punished, over suspended for doing nothing more than any other kid does in school. That's when, imagination began to churn. Like, can we do things differently? Fast forward a few years to me being a researcher. I'm in an English classroom. And I encounter these 4 young Black men sitting in the back of the room, and I would come to their classroom every day for over the course of a month. After a while, they would save a seat for me in the back of the room. And they weren't reading and writing in this classroom. The teacher would assign texts like Beowulf. They wouldn't read it. They would complain about it. Sometimes they had their heads down. They weren't reading. They weren't writing. And I'm like, wow, maybe they are disengaged readers. Then I began to ask the other question. The other question was, am I reading Beowulf this weekend? And I would ask that to the audience. Are you reading Beowulf this weekend? And the answer is probably no. In fact, you're probably not reading it if it's not assigned to you. And it was at that moment that I understood that we were asking the wrong questions. The question wasn't about disengaged readers. It was about disengaged classrooms and disengaged books and disengaged teachers. So when I followed these young men outside of the classroom, I caught them reading and I caught them reading and writing in ways that, we did not predict or value or understand deeply that they were readers, they were writers. And we needed to capture that. We needed to capture them. We needed to listen to them. We needed to affirm them and their literacies in ways that we haven't currently did. And then I began to understand that's the question. And then it gave me some other questions like, what are their literacies? Why do they read and write? And why don't they read and write? And it was at that moment that the game just changed for me. Back from the days where we punished and criminalized Sean because we did not see or value or understand his intelligence, to what I was locating in my own work, the ways that we were shaped to beg the wrong types of questions that normalized the thing that did not celebrate the ways that some people show up. How can we celebrate, affirm the ways that some people show up? That was my question.
I love that. I love that. And I heard your mention of Sean, and I wonder if that's the same Sean that you talk about in A Search Past Silence, your book. It reminds me a lot of him. That research question that you entered into that book with was, what is the nature of literacy and learning among African American males in high school settings, particularly in English classrooms? And you really show us how we don't have a way of valuing that. We don't value that in our classrooms. But you, I think, in your travels with these students and you're involving yourself in these students' lives, really did get a strong sense of what literacy and learning looks like in the lives of these young men. Can you sketch it? Now, I realize that's like a book-like topic, and you've really hit on that in a couple different ways, but can you sketch out an answer to that question, that research question that you went into that book with? What is the nature of literacy and learning among African American adolescent men?
Yeah, well, that was part of the question. Part of it, what is the nature? That question wasn't sufficient. I mean, the other question that in Search Past Silence that I began to ask is, why and how are literacy in the lives of young Black men, and boys? And I thought that was the more important question, because at some point I realized that, it's not about Maslow. I mean, it's not about Bloom, excuse me. It's not about questions of what we teach. It's about Maslow, or questions of who we teach. How can we understand deeply the relationship, the human relationship, the emotional relationship, right? The social and emotional relationship that these young men have to literacy, the historical relationship. When you read Search, you rarely hear me talk about literacy itself, because literacy is not about literacy. Literacy is not just about the practices of reading and writing. Literacy is not just about what's on a page. In fact, it's about what's off the page. In fact, it's probably mostly about what's off the page. The relationship that the individual has, with the sociology and the psychology around the text, the experience that they're having with the text, and their relationship that they're having with the world as the text gets embedded within that world. These young men already, they had relationships with text. They were told that they weren't supposed to read particular things, like literacy and literatures, right? Text and words and language had been gendered, they had been raced, they had been erased and classed and all of these other things. But I mean, questions like how can you read when your focus is being competed with a hungry belly? Or with the types of tragic, traumatic events that happen to young Black men in the hood? Like, how does that relate to this question of literacy, when it very much does? Because either we sit with one proposition or the other. We sit with the proposition that the reading differences that we see with young Black men is because they lack literacy, or there's something else going on. And my conclusion is, it's not because they lack the capability of being literate or they lack literacy. It's something else that's going on. It's something about the relationship, the how and the why of literacy, that constructed them in relationship to this concept. Right. So when they did read and write, it was constructed in relationship to how they were made within the social ecology, the social and emotional ecologies that they inhabited.
Right. And it feels like a lot of what you're expressing is stuff that maybe, beyond the scope of the classroom, but certainly isn't going to necessarily show up, in our current posture toward these students. You talk about, how can we better value those literacies, plural. We don't have a lot of tools for capturing that information, and you bring in a whole other dimension of what are those sort of relationships that they have to the literature and the literacies that we are kind of offering to them, I suppose. And there's a lot of, that's a very fraught relationship. Well, I think it reminds me of, go ahead.
I was going to say, Arthur, I would back up, with your suggestion, right? And that is whether or not, some of the social-emotional, kind of sociological human stuff is stuff of the classroom. Yeah. I mean, we can say that it's not our job to repair the brokenness, the fissures, the cracks that we face inside the class. We can say that's not the case. If that's not the case, and we inherit, individuals, who are struggling through society because of historical, racial, social, political, these deep things, if we punt, then we're saying that we can't teach certain kids, or that we have not designed the system, to be responsive to those kids. I mean, if that's the stance that we're taking, then I think that we need to be honest with those families and with those kids about that stance. That school is not constructed to be responsive to what the needs are that you have. Or we can take another stance. And that stance is that we can learn to reshape and redesign the mechanisms of education so that they can be most responsive to the needs of those young people. And teacher education, I lament teacher education all the time, because we have, these aspiring young people who want to go into our beautiful profession, and we teach them to teach people who they will never meet. At least we never teach them to teach the students that they will struggle the most with. So they go into those classroom spaces underprepared. And it's a travesty. We have an opportunity, and I would even argue an obligation, to redesign education, to fundamentally rethink the system, because the babies aren't broken, but the system is. And we can reimagine that system in order to be most responsive to the individual young people that we sit with, where school becomes a site of healing, where it becomes a space where we do that hard, deep work, where prerequisite to literacy are things like healing, right? We understand that the basics of literacy, of reading and writing, are not books and language, that the basics of literacy are things like pleasure, play, curiosity, and creativity. And when they're hurting, it's healing, right? We can actually fundamentally build a space where all kids can fall in love with words, where all kids can, begin to think about their relationship with literacy far differently, where all young people, if they're hurting, can come to school and find a space of healing, where love becomes centered in the classroom space. And in that logic, we can actually create that. We can invent it, because the best way to predict the future is to invent it.
I totally agree. I think I was going in a little bit of a different direction with that, but you illuminated basically, I think the whole thing for me. But I think the thing that I get at, though, is as you make this case where you totally turn the tables on that deficit language, and you promise, yes, there are some things, very much need to be addressed in terms of the social, emotional, and economic, all of the various realities that affect our students and must be addressed in order for students to be in a position to learn. At the same time, there's this expectation, and I think the kind of thing that we value in our classrooms is this very narrow, uncomplicated idea about literacy. So this is kind of a different angle that I feel that you touch on in a very rich way, where you say, in part because of probably some of these complex negotiations that I think some of these students have had to deal with, they develop a kind of literacy that is really quite a bit more rich than a 5-paragraph essay. It's a kind of literacy that is complex, beautiful, and that I think a lot of our tests and our grades and our measures and our empirical methods just do not pick up on, because those methods are premised on this idea that we're coming from kind of like a vacuum, and these students don't come from a vacuum, and because of that, they've developed this amazingly rich literacy, but also like relationship to literacy and so many other things that how can we miss that richness? And it's so much more rich than so much of what's valued in schools. Just taking, for example, the 5-paragraph essay. That's not a rich form of literacy. What is it about this observational, reductive, uncomplicated, that misses that, that entirely misses that. And then I guess the next follow-up question is, what do you do instead? How do you do that? Because what I hear and what I see and what I read in your books is you conversing with them, visiting with them, examining artifacts, events, being there with these students. And I think that this is almost an ethos of assessment. I mean, I wish there were like a learning management system that could capture that, because I really feel like at the end of reading your books that I am getting insight into that richness. And yet that's a kind of richness that we don't see, and then we don't report schools. So how do we get better at that?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think, or sets of questions. I think they're important. I think the first question is important, and that is this question about why don't we value, literacies that go beyond the specter of, kind of like the human possibility, right? Why don't we have a more, robust, a more, sacrosanct definition, that we can like hold on to when it comes to literacy? And that question is not that complicated. There are some bodies in this country that we value, and there are some that we don't, right? When we begin to think about intersectional racial justice, when we begin to think about, the ways that we have privilege of value and value systems have been the marketplace of the development of our country, we get clues about, how schools operate and how they work. We begin to understand, where the fault lines are, right? We get a sense of how to locate, particular things. We saw that this was the case in math and science, for women, when we didn't necessarily value the types of things, the community cultural wealth, the funds of knowledge that women bring into, STEM spaces. Those spaces didn't necessarily work for them. But because of courageous work of feminists and other, justice-oriented educators, we've been able to move the needle some. We have a long way to go in that area, but we've been able to move it some, right, toward this question of how do we value and how do we fix our value systems? And this isn't to indict or to say that you have a bad guy on one end, kind of like pulling the, kind of strings of bias. Like that our system in some ways embraces its own implicit biases. Our value systems in education, how we understand and determine or define literacy, has its own value system that's part of, kind of the public narrative. And that public narrative is, is littered, it's filthy, it's dirty, contaminated by our own prejudices. Right. And so the big question is, how do we get here? How do we get to the place we are? Well, we haven't necessarily grappled with the fact that we live in a racist, sexist, system that, privileges things like ability oppression, economic oppression, where deficit theories are pretty much an expression of deviations from whatever we consider to be normal or whatever we value. Right. And we can reimagine that, too. We can reimagine the fundamental aspect of what and how we value. In fact, if we don't reimagine that, we won't assess it, because our assessments reflect the things that we value and they neglect the things that we do not value. So until we begin to have that difficult, beautiful conversation about how can we value Black language, how can we value Black ways of literacy, how can we begin to value Black ways of doing school, Black culture, Black style, Black expression, Black ideologies within this context, this pluralistic context of Americana, and we're not going to move much. We're not going to value differently in ways that will matter within our classrooms.
Yeah. And I think you make one thing that pops up for me is that you point out, though, the irony of this for me is that so much of the thinking that has been done around, the kind of valuing, the kind of, I guess, goals we should have for ourselves as literate individuals have become so much more rich. And I find it kind of interesting that you kind of dismiss the French and the Russians at the beginning of your book, and you know, it's in A Search of the Past Silence. But the funny thing is that so much of what you describe in the lives of those students is really what we've been straining toward anyway. I mean, it's this complex, rich, interconnected, situated literacies that I feel would be, honestly, would be good for everyone if we were able to look at literacy in that way. So what is it? What is it that's enshrining this impoverished, eviscerated idea of literacy? And I mean, I know there's probably a very simple answer to that question, but how, I mean, you describe a little bit of how that we've been able to move the dial on some of these other subject areas. Have you seen some concrete ways that teachers have been able to do that a little bit, and to embrace, really, I mean, this is not like, honestly, it's not rocket science that this is what our definition of literacy should be.
Yeah, yeah.
I think we're all in agreement about that.
You want to know what I mean? The revolutions don't, and the revolution in education, revolution in literacy, you know, happens without us. You know, we will be left in the past,
Mm-hmm.
the literate past, if we don't catch up, right? Educators, especially literacy educators, you know, will make ourselves, you know, just non-essential, not important, you know, in the conversation around literacy, if we don't begin to consider the new ways, because the literacy terrain has moved light years ahead. I've been thinking about hip hop. You know, now we have TikTok, and I was in a conversation with teachers, and they were talking about TikTok inside the classroom, and using TikTok as this, you know, space and this source to imagine, reimagine, to, you know, create possibility and joy within the digital learning space, right? And imagine the type of multimodal literacies that happen within that domain in the ways that young people have already constructed and created. But we will be, you know, prisoners of the past if we stay and we remain in this place, which is grounded and anchored to our biases and our bigotries, right? We have to move, and we have to let those things go. And when we let those things go, we will be elevated. And not only will we be elevated, our young people will be elevated too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to touch on one thing, and content here, and I wish we could go for hours, but I'm going to start to rein it in with one. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. You were cutting out a second ago.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. Okay, so I feel like another critical side of this question is, as you involve TikTok, as you involve hip hop and that sort of thing, I think of that journal, if you remember from your book, of Derek, and it is this like initial sort of vignette that you start your book with, where why doesn't he write like this in class, is what his teacher discovered the journal and asked this question, why doesn't he write this way in class? And I feel like there is this other side, which is there's some distrust there. There's some reluctance to reveal this beauty, this some resistance, maybe even to have any of this beauty and complexity associated with schools. And so, you know, to even allow the teacher, as you wrote in another place, unlock the hidden and protected vaults of that literacy how do teachers begin to break down those walls? And I don't maybe that's a bad metaphor, break down those walls, but how do we invite that in a way where they would even be willing?
Yeah, I think you cut out, Arthur, on me, but I'll go ahead and just respond to the kind of like the tenor of your question, and that is what can and what should we be doing in order to create an invitation for our young people to learn. And I think there's so much that we can and should be doing. So if you look at the scene in chapter 1 of Search Past Silence, the teacher finds a journal and she, asks the question of Derek, why don't you write like this in school, in my class, which was the wrong question to ask. There's 1,000,001 other questions that she could have asked other than this punitive question, right? The question was pointing fingers back at him where she should have been pointing fingers back at herself, right? What can I do to get you to write like this in my class? How can we rethink and reconstruct the situation of education in order to do this type of work? Or what can I do in order to understand what you can do? Right? Part of that is that we have to center listening as a pedagogical practice. Do things like hold listening sessions with students. My colleague Niobe Way talks about thick listening. And thick listening as a process of transformation and transforming our relationships with one another. When do we have interview protocols? Empathy interviews with students, other things that allow us to hear from them so that they can inform us about how to teach them. To be sure, right? Those who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. Right? If you want to teach somebody, you should know something about them in order to craft and create the space, the relationship that is necessary. And it does not begin with what you have in your head. Right? And that's an old way of thinking about pedagogy, but we know it doesn't work. Right? We're in a moment where people understand deeply what they can do. They understand deeply what they want. They want to participate. So the next thing is, how do we carve out and construct participatory opportunities for the young people who we want to learn with, can lead some of that work? How can learning be about participation? How can it be a social space, a space that we go together, not a paternalistic space, where we have some, father didact speaking at people, or even a maternalistic space where we have, kids filling out, nurturing, worksheets. How can it be participatory? How can it be social? How can it evolve my input and my buy-in? How might we democratize that space after listening? And then how can it be a space where trust and healing and joy are developed, right? How can it be a human space? Because I understand that there is a relationship to the stuff that you want to bring into the classroom. And I understand that you've had this relationship with schooling where it hasn't been safe to bring your whole self to school because we punish particular bodies within the school space. We punish particular content, particular artifacts of particular lives within the school space. How can we reimagine that? How can we shift and change the conversation in ways that we get to new results? Right? How can we develop like this human experience within the classroom? How can we humanize that moment? Listening, right? That's something that they don't teach us to do, right? But the thing that we're learning right now in this COVID situation, we don't have all the answers. That the directions that were well carved out for us aren't necessarily the directions that we need to be moving into as we move forward. The second thing is that if we want to go fast, we go alone. But if we want to go far, we go together. right? And if we want to go far with our young people, give them opportunities to participate, participatory practices, democratizing the educational experience so that those who are most implicated by the decisions that we make have some say in those decisions. And then humanize the education process, centering things like healing and joy and trust, right? Moving at the speed of trust, because these things make sense. That's how we get to where you want to go.
Yeah. Oh boy, Dr. Kirkland, I wish we could keep going. And I have a couple questions that I just wanted to go back to. I think I have one question, mostly just people quoting you and saying how great what you're saying is. We have one question here from Shane, who wanted to know how we can prepare our new teachers to teach students. Any thoughts on that one?
Yeah. There are few answers, to this question, and the unfortunate part is we're talking about much of teacher education is dependent upon an antiquated system, that's heavily involved in, theories that were based on people who don't necessarily teach, and theories of education from people who don't necessarily do well in education, and theories about it's not going to, that way isn't going to work. So the first answer is we have to move teacher education to a new place too. If we're going to move teaching to a new place, we have to move teacher education to a new place. And, I want to challenge my colleagues, to take me up on that. Let's move teacher education to a new place that understands that, the practice of humanization begins with a practice of humanization, that we can't expect teachers to humanize their classrooms if we have not humanized ours. If we have not humanized teacher education spaces, we cannot expect it. Right. And part of that reimagining of teacher education, right, will mean dealing with this idea that we suffer from some of the same biases that I was talking about. In teacher education, we norm as the typical student, as the student that all teachers will teach students who come from, two-family homes, students who are well-fed, students, who are socio-emotionally put together, who on Bloom's taxonomy or hierarchy of needs, not Bloom, but Maslow's hierarchy of needs, have all of their needs met. That's our starting point in teacher education. We don't start with the actual students that the teachers are going to go into their classrooms and teach. So first, our intervention has to be, an intervention on the people who are teaching the teachers, right? If the people who are teaching the teachers have never met the students that the teachers will teach, they won't know how to prepare them. And that's just the dirty, messy truth. And I know it's probably going to make a lot of people mad. We have to do a better job in teacher education. For the teachers who are in classrooms, well, you are not with resources. The families, the young people, they have valuable things to contribute. My colleague Louis Moore calls it funds of knowledge. Chris Gutierrez calls it repertoires of practice. Terry Yasso, community cultural wealth. Let's value that. And let's constantly see ourselves as learners, right? Teaching, part of teaching should be, this idea that we're constantly learning how to teach. Teachers should see ourselves as ethnographers, people who are deeply interested in investing in the lives and the cultures and the substances of the young people that we teach. We also should see ourselves as partners, that we're not teaching alone, that we are enlisting the support of those people who know most about their lives. So if you don't know much about the students, I bet they know a lot about themselves. How do we give up space? How do we give up power and authority in order to share power? The only thing wrong with power, right? I like to talk about power with prepositions, right? Power over is ultimately bad. That's oppressive power. But power within, empowerment is beautiful. We should move our classrooms to empower our students. But beyond that, collective power, power with, is important. We need to develop the opportunities that, for students to have power within that space and for us to share it with them. That's how we get to know them better. And not only get to know them better, begin to create with them. Because education is a collective, social thing, not an autonomous individual that we pour into empty vessels. It is something that we co-develop together.
Yeah. And, I keep remembering, your own approach to ethnography, and embedding and involving yourself with students and practicing that thick listening that you're talking about. I mean, it's honestly reading that book, which is just, and some other things you've written, like, what is it? We Real Cool is another one where you follow a group of students. There's this willingness to listen deeply and to experience and sit beside them, which to me is the definition of assessments, to sit beside. And to me, I feel reading a lot of what you've written, that does give us a picture of what that would look like. What would that look like to, not just maintain this objective Archimedean point that I'm going to objectively measure your success, but that I'm actually going to involve myself with you, and I'm going to listen to you, and there's going to be a dialogue, not a monologue, just coming from me. Honestly, I would say, if you wanted to see, read some of David Kirkland's writing and his ethnography, his approach, to me, is a great model of what teachers might be able to do in their classrooms. I mean, I know that wasn't what you were aiming for. That wasn't your end necessarily, David, but to me, that's a beautiful picture.
Well, I always write for teachers. I always write for teachers. Even when I'm writing for my academic colleagues, they're my secondary audience. I want to transform education. I want to transform students. That's why I show up at events like this. To me, it's important, to be in community and conversation with people who are on the ground, because we can actually change this. Just to follow up, and offer Shane just a few other, pieces of advice. Shane is a good friend of mine. How you doing, Shane? It's good to see you. Is that there are some things that we have to reject too. So if we want to get to know students, we have to reject a few things. One thing that we have to reject, certainly are some of the biases that we bring into classroom. We have to reject racial biases, gender biases, ability biases, and some of the other biases that we have, that we bring with us. We also have to reject, and we have to reject full-throatedly, deficit theories. Deficit theories is this idea of always looking at our students and their communities as lacking. Right. And so instead, we have to look at them, not for what they lack, but for what they possess. Instead of looking at them for what they can't do, we have to look at them for what they can do, and begin to search for that question. James Baldwin said, and he said it best, we have to search deeply within answers for the questions they conceal, constantly begging ourselves, right? Interrogating the decisions that we make, begging new questions constantly, in order to get this thing right. We're not stopping with this idea that, this is how it is. It's not how it is. The babies aren't broken. The system is. We can reimagine and we can redesign it and we can get it right, but we have to be persistent. Right. And we have to reject that deficit theory, the deficit theorization that leaves us in a deficit. Because we're not talking about failing students. The question is, how are we failing students? And once we pose that question, we can get closer to succeeding them.
Absolutely. Well, I have gone over, but I'm not sorry, because I needed to hear the rest of that. So I just want to thank you again, David, for your generosity, for your hope, and for your message, and for your vision. So appreciate your taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you so much, Arthur. Appreciate it.
Yeah. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for this episode of TG2Chat Live. If you find this content valuable, please support our efforts by becoming a Patreon supporter. At this time, we'd like to thank our patrons who have made all this sort of content possible. This was such a rich experience for me. And so it looks like for Dina as well, and for my principal. So I'm really glad that we had this opportunity. Like to encourage all of you to join us this Sunday for another NYU Steinhardt School of Education Dennis and Sarah back talking dialogic feedback. So go Bobcats. I didn't even realize that before today, but I wanted to say that. Go NYU Bobcats. On the TG2Chat Twitter chat. For more information, visit the events page at teachersgoinggradelists.com. Once again, David, thank you so much. And I am so looking forward to the day when we have a chance to meet in person. And stay safe and stay well. And hopefully our paths will cross again soon.
See you soon. Take care.
Okay.
Bye.
All right. Take care, everyone.